Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter Select, a seasonal podcast where we bounce back and forth between a series of games exploring their evolution, design, and legacy. For this season 5, we are covering the Resident Evil series. My name is Max Roberts, and I'm joined, as always, by Logan Moore. Hi, Logan.
Max, it is finally time for you to join the zombie family.
Oh my gosh. I thought you were going to make a Jill sandwich joke. I was waiting for the sandwich joke.
No, maybe we'll have some Jill sandwich jokes later. But no, this is finally time that we bring you into the Resident Evil fold this season.
Would you say bring me in under the umbrella?
Yes, exactly. There you go. You found a good Resident Evil pun or joke. Yes, it's time I bring you under the umbrella of the Resident Evil fandom, which I am very, very excited about because it's really great how we've set these up. So if
it's a good juxtaposition.
If you're a long-time listener of the show, obviously this is our sixth season here that we're doing with Resident Evil.
Fifth. So 6.
Yeah, sixth season sort of. This is our 5th season properly. With season 4, we're doing Fast and Furious, and that was a season that I knew nothing about before coming into it, and Max knew everything about. Now we've turned the tables. I have been preaching the Resident Evil gospel since I was a youngster, and Max has never really played any of these games. Which I think we can, let's just talk about that up front before we get too much into talking about today's episode, which will be centered around Resident Evil 1, obviously. But yeah, I'm coming into this as sort of the pseudo expert. I have played all of these games that we're going to play before. The only ones I have not played are the Revelations games, which I even might play at some point over the course of this season, just because I've never done that. You've only played, to my knowledge, 7? 2 remake, 3 and 3 remake, I think.
I've played half of 7. I've played 8 to completion. I've played half of 2. Played the Leon campaign. I've played.
Okay, so you didn't even do the dual routes.
I platinumed 3, so I've played 3 a lot. And I am working my way through Resident Evil 4 VR before we started this season on Quest. So
gotcha.
I'm not done with that game, but I have just recently started it. So,
and you've obviously played 1 now, which we'll talk about
1 now.
Here.
But really, I hadn't played Resident Evil until 7 came out, and I got that because it was a PSVR launch title. And I wanted, that seemed like a perfect companion piece for that. And we'll talk about that in Resident Evil 7 episode. But that was my exposure to the series. And then I grabbed 2 cheap at a GameStop one time just because people talked about it. It seemed fun. And then 8, when it came out, I had a coupon, like $20 off I had to spend at Best Buy. So that got me Resident Evil Village. And 3 was kind of, I kept hearing 3 was short. So I wanted something quick and snappy to play.
There's something alluring about short games. That's why I'm currently playing, at the time we're recording this, a Call of Duty game. Like I told you I was playing Black Ops 2 and you're like, why? I'm like, I don't know. Just short, dumb game I can play for no reason.
Yeah. And Resident Evil 3 was that for me this year. Earlier this year is when I played and platinum that game within 2 weeks. It was a very tight window and I had a blast with it. And then now Resident Evil 1.
I am, conversely, so you've never played most of these. I'm excited to revisit these because I have not played most of these games seriously since whatever. I'll tell, I forget it. I'll just tell we'll get into the rundown of Resident Evil 1 here in a second, but I'll share my own legacy and history of this series, I guess, up front too. I remember when Resident Evil 5 was coming out. I've told this story on podcasts before, but I've obviously never told it here, so we'll get this out of the way up front to start the season. I remember when Resident Evil 5 was coming out, and I was really excited for that game, and I thought it looked awesome. But my tick that I have always had with larger game franchises is, I can't just jump into 5. I got to play all of them. So I went to GameStop, and I bought Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 on GameCube. I bought Resident Evil 0, I bought Resident Evil 4, I bought Resident Evil Code Veronica, and I forced myself to play through all of them.
All on GameCube?
I played 1, 2, 3 on GameCube. I played 0 on GameCube. I played 4 on PS2, and I played Code Veronica on PS2.
You should have played them all on GameCube, because then you would truly have like the most valuable set of Resident Evil games, because that was an interesting time, was when it was like Resident Evil went kind of GameCube exclusive for a hot minute, and it was awesome.
Yeah, I just remember playing through all of them with the goal of like, oh, I need to do this all so I have the full context of what happens in 5. And then when I played 5 in the moment, I was like, that was fine. Like, kind of the same thing that happened. I did a similar thing with Metal Gear Solid when Metal Gear Solid 4 was coming out. I was like, I gotta play all these games before Metal Gear Solid 4. And then retroactively, after I finished Guns of the Patriots, I was like, I think Metal Gear Solid 3 is actually much better. I like that game more. So it's funny how those things work out. But yeah, I mean, since then, I played all of the games as if it was work with the goal of getting to 5. But as time went on, I was like, I just really like all of these games for what they're doing. And yeah, I think I played them all when I was in middle school for the first time. And since then, I've just been a huge fan. I will say this to get this out of the way up front. I have never played 6 to completion. It is my blind spot. When I saw 6, I was like, nah, I don't want this. And
so we can do it together.
So we will finish 6 together when we get to it further in the season. But today, let's talk about the game that started it all, which is Resident Evil, the original game in the series. It was developed, as all other games in the series are, by Capcom. It originally released on PlayStation. It later came to PC, Saturn, Nintendo DS. It was remade for GameCube, which is the version that we played, the HD version of that game at least. We'll get into some of those nuances here in a second. It originally released on March 22nd, 1996. It then released on the same date in 2002, which is kind of cool, on GameCube. The HD version, which came to PS4, Xbox One, PC, and other platforms, arrived in 2015. A DS version of the game called Deadly Silence, Resident Evil Deadly Silence, released on February 7th as well. You told me to jot that down for reasons I imagine we'll get into here in a bit. The game director on this was Shinji Mikami. The producers were Takuro Fujiwara and Masayuki Akahori. And the music was done by Makoto Tomozawa, Koichi Hiroki, and Masama Ueda. The game's Metacritic score was a 91 out of 100. It had the same Metacritic score for the GameCube remake as well. So that's the rundown of Resident Evil 1. We've already talked about our histories, I guess, with this game in particular. I can get into some more specifics. I guess, what was your exposure to this game? Did you have any specific exposure to this specific game before we played it?
No, I knew nothing about the iconic lines like Jill Sandwich and things along those lines.
Master of Unlocking. You didn't know any of this?
No, I had no idea.
You might still not, because we played the remake version, obviously, which changes some of those lines. So a lot of the iconic lines from the game are really only in the 1996 version, which I did dabble with, the Director's Cut edition, because it's on PlayStation Plus Premium or Extra. I think Premium, because it's part of the Classics catalog or whatever, which is only part of the Premium version. But I did dabble with that. I did play that for a bit, and it is so... We could talk about some of that. We'll talk about some of that a little bit later.
I plan on dabbling with it too on my Mister. That's something I definitely want to experiment with, just to get a real taste for the leap in the remake. Some, as context for later episodes and stuff. But it is... I really had no context for this game at a time. I didn't know, playing Resident Evil 3 earlier this year, I didn't know where Jill came from. Like, that's how oblivious. I only know Chris is important because he's in other games and people talk about him.
You probably only know Leon because of Resident Evil 4's popularity, I would imagine. So seeing him, and I would guess before 2, you probably didn't even know he was really in that.
I kind of you see pictures and stuff, but I know Leon's game is 4. Like, that's where Leon kind of blows up in popularity. But yeah, this game, I knew nothing about this game.
Yes, I mean, so for me, again, with my whole story, this was the first one I played after I went and mass bought all of them. I remember being very...
Really quick, why did you not start with 0? As someone who didn't... I assume, did you know that 0 was a game that came later in the series?
I did some research beforehand, and I knew that 0 was a prequel 2, 1, so its impact on the larger series was really only felt if you did play 1 first.
Okay. So you knew it came later.
Yeah,
Okay.
I knew that it was chronologically the first one, but I knew that the characters in it show up originally in Resident Evil 1. And it just made sense to start with the game that started it all, even though it was a remake or whatever. But yeah, I remember starting this game and just being very off-put by the tank controls, for one, which is something that I don't know if you ever experienced or tried for yourself. I tried to explain that and talk to you about it. That was the first thing. The ink ribbon system was baffling to me as a kid when I first started this. Like, well, I can't save infinitely? What are you talking about? And I can only save if I have this. Like, there are so many, I screwed myself so many times in the early runs of the first run I did of this game. I totally botched because I just thought you could save willy-nilly, and quickly got myself into a lot of trouble because I did not know what I was doing. So it really just, typical experience that I think a lot of people had when they first played this game, even though I was late to the party in a lot of ways of playing the Resident Evil series. I did still have the same experience that I think a lot of others did when this franchise first came about back in the 90s, because it started with the first game, went in relatively blind. The only thing I really knew is, this is zombies. It becomes a large sprawling franchise that has been made into movies and all kinds of other countless things. And I know the first game takes place in a mansion, and that was about my only exposure to it. Since that time that I played the game originally all those years ago, I have not revisited it. So this is really the first time I've gone back to the game in probably 10 to 15 years, I would say. So this playthrough for me in particular has been a fun one. I've really enjoyed going back to this, and I think, broadly speaking, this game, I am surprised at how well it holds up. Because a lot of these older adventure-style games, I do not think they have aged well. Like, I think about some of the older, like, Monkey Island stuff, or...
Well, that's even older.
Yeah, like the LucasArts stuff, like those old OG adventure games, which this is very much in the same mold of, to a degree, with the puzzles and stuff like that. It is a survival game, though, so it's got those sorts of different elements, and there's a lot of inventory management. There's combat mechanics and stuff. So it's not a one-to-one of old school adventure games in that manner, but it is cut from the same sort of cloth. And some of those older games, like I remember a couple of years ago, I played like Day of the Tentacle, and I was like, wow, this really does. The writing's still great, but nothing else really holds up super well, in my opinion. This game, I think it has aged somewhat gracefully for being a 26-year-old video game. Like the remake visually, I think still holds up. There's a lot of things. Chime in here. I'm curious to hear what you think.
On the whole, sure. I think...
We're talking about a game that's almost 3 decades old. Like that's the qualifications I'm giving it here, because a lot of games back from the 90s.
I get that. I'd certainly the PS4 version that we played here came out in 2015. I think maybe we could have touched the GameCube code a little bit, maybe clean some things up. There's some stuff that's frustrating that I think doesn't need to be here to capture the spirit. A specific example would be the map, not just after you try a door telling you which lock it is. Like, for the love of God, that was a sword, a helmet, a chest. Like, I can't remember. And with such a limit,
you started playing this before me, and when I started playing, like a week or so after, and I was catching up and going through the game again, I remembered that was a thing. And I think I texted you. I was like, hey, so how do you feel about the map not telling you which doors correspond with which keys? And you're like, yeah, not loving it. Because that was something I forgot about too, that the remakes have really, that's such a small thing that the remake games have done. But it really is like a huge improvement.
I feel like, they could have touch that up a little bit. I struggle with it a bit, because is changing something to make it easier or more clearly communicated, does that rob it of the horror? Does that rob it of the survival? An example I think of is, in my reading and understanding, is in the first game, When you killed a zombie after 8 bullets or whatever, a pool of blood, it was dead. Didn't necessarily come back. But in the GameCube remake, you kill a zombie, it will be dead, but it can come back as a crimson head.
Yes.
And the only way to get rid of it is to either randomly step on it and crush its skull, which is a random prompt, you can't engage that, or to burn the corpse, which requires 2 items in your already limited item inventory.
You just need 1, right? Because you have the lighter on you already.
Fluid and the lighter.
Oh, I don't know. That might be one of the differences. So we should say this up front. So
we
Max
both played opposite routes.
We both played opposite routes. This was originally not our intention, and we were talking about playing both routes before doing this episode. But for time constraints, we have to play like 10 other games in this season. So we didn't want to double dip and do both routes in this. So the workaround is Max played Jill's route and I played Chris's route. Does Jill not have the lighter? Because Chris has the lighter by default. It is in his inventory and it does not take up a slot.
So Jill gets a lockpick.
Okay,
and you cannot swap that out. I was like, for the love of God, I don't want the lockpick. I would like the lighter. Because the lockpick works on like 2 doors. It's not really, in my experience, very useful. I can't pick any special lock. So, you
still need all the keys that are designated to the specific doors and stuff like that. Yeah.
So canteen, lighter, 2 slots. And then I was very cautious. So I always had my pistol in a magazine. And for about half the game, I didn't take out ink ribbons either. So I was really limiting myself. I wouldn't use shotgun ammo. I was like, I need this for later in the game.
You're going to need it for the boss fights or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was very conservative up front. And really,
which is not a bad way to play. It really is not. I was pretty conservative early on.
When I turned to a guide about over halfway through.
Which is not a bad decision either. I still had to consult a guide for this one too.
I was like, we need help to just kind of ease this up a little bit. So, but that example of burning the corpses, it's explained somewhat like in a collectible that you can pick up and read, and it's like, oh, they burn. But it doesn't, it's that adventure game logic of, I have lighter fluid in a canteen and a lighter, I can burn these corpses. I guess I could have looked at the trophies and like ascertained that you can burn a corpse. But there was a point in the game where I had killed almost every zombie I had encountered, was pretty meticulous with that. And then there's about a halfway point, not a halfway point, but maybe, a third or a quarter of the way through the game, where suddenly there's a bunch of crimson heads running around after me, and the game got hard.
Yeah.
Like, hard. And I was very frustrated. I wrote down, I was like, this doesn't feel very good. I was also frustrated with the, save room. Not the restriction on saving. I like that. That adds an element of stress and strategy to the horror survival element of it. But I found myself saving in one save room for most of the game. I was pretty sick of the East storeroom save room. I was like, why can't there be more? Not more of these, but just a more strategic placement. I felt like I always needed to be near that one. I don't know. It's just, there's some things that have not aged gracefully, but it doesn't take away from the effectiveness.
Here's the thing I want to say. I love everything you're saying, because I think it's less of, I think if you replayed this game, some of your qualms would dissipate, and that's not to say that what you're saying is not valid, but it very much sounds like growing pains of understanding how this game works. Because for me, I felt identical to how you are feeling when I first played this game as a kid. I was like, man, this sucks. Like, I tried to kill all the zombies and then they turned into crimson heads. I'm like, no, what is going on? I felt like I could not take ink ribbons out of my inventory. This time I always stashed them in my box because I knew if I ever needed them, there was going to be an inventory box right next to the typewriter and I would just swap them out or whatever. Like things like that. Like these are things that I learned for this, that I remembered from when I first played the game. And when I went back this time, I was like, oh, okay, I kind of know how to play this game now. So the things you are complaining about, I think it's a mix. I do agree that some of those elements have not aged the best, and the game doesn't communicate a lot of that to you. But at the same time, they are this is why this is a run-based game, I think, in a lot of ways. Like some of the trophies in this game are like beat the game in under this amount of time, or
There's a lot of replay game trophies.
Resident Evil has always been a run-based game series for the most part. Like these are games that are designed in a lot of ways for people to replay over and over again. And I think a lot of that, especially with this first game, is the first run through is going to be difficult, and you're going to have to learn your way around the mansion, which we'll talk about the mansion a little bit more here in a second. But two, just how the game, in some ways, how it wants you to play it, or how you should play it, or the things you should be thinking of in your head while you are playing. There are ideal ways. A lot of it comes down to inventory management. There are ideal specific things that you might want to keep in mind as you are playing through the game. And I think if you did play the other route with Chris, a lot of those problems you would have, again, I don't know if they would completely go away, but I think you would have a much easier time. Like you would remember these things up front, like, okay, I just killed this zombie. Now I need to light the body on fire. Or maybe what I do, and what a lot of people do, is you just don't even kill the zombies in this game. Like if you can just run past them without having to shoot them, like a lot of times I'd pop around a corner, shoot a zombie. If it falls over, cool, then I'm running past it. Like I'm not trying to kill most of the zombies that I come across in this game. The only exceptions would be like dogs. Killed the dogs. Dogs gotta die.
Oh my gosh. That was yeah, dogs were not my friend. So I died, I'd have to pull up the picture to see. I died quite a few times. But I definitely died twice in the beginning of the game before I even saved. So I had to restart the whole game over again. That was a learning curve of I just need to save at least past all the intro stuff. It is, it is a lot to learn. There is a steep learning curve, more so than the other games I had played in the series.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think what's interesting that you have played the 2 remake games, at least 3 and half of 2, like you said, is that you understand how the remake games have kept the core of what's introduced here alive, while obviously streamlining and making certain things a little bit more accessible in those games.
Like a map that shows you which key goes to which door.
Exactly. Like they keep a lot of the inventory management and that sort of stuff alive, but there's obviously, it's third person. You can aim more directly rather than just kind of aiming broadly and praying that good things happen.
Aim level up or down.
Yeah. So you can see how the improvements have been made there with the remakes, and we'll obviously talk about those in the future episodes as well. But yeah, Resident Evil 1 nowadays, because this is the sole game in the series that has not received not sole game in the series, but this is the least modernized game in the franchise at this point, which is kind of funny because this is a remake unto itself that we have played. But it is now the one in the series that is kind of its own thing. And Code Veronica still is somewhat similar, but even that game is more palatable. So is Resident Evil 0. Again, we'll get into this all as we go throughout the season. I'm very excited. Again, the things you've said about this makes me excited. One thing I want to touch on with this game in particular that I want to dive into before we get into some of these other things that we have on our notes. I want to talk about this game as a survival game, because I think this is one of the great things that the original Resident Evil does. The survival horror genre in a lot of ways is built on the back of Resident Evil and Silent Hill and a lot of these games from the early to mid 90s. And I think what other games in the genre don't do, like there's always item scarcity and ammo scarcity in a lot of other survival horror games, even in something like, The Last of Us or Dead Space. Like you don't have unlimited ammo all the times. But I think this game's inventory system and how I don't think the horror from this game intrinsically comes from the fact that zombies are chasing you and there are monsters around every corner. It is very much from the fact that you are strapped with the inventory space that you have, the items that you are finding, and just the fact that if you die, you're going to have to go back to a certain save point. And it's amplified because you don't want to die and have to go back to a save point. Like if you die in Dead Space or whatever, you'll go back to a certain checkpoint. Like you're not probably going to lose that much progress in modern survival horror games. This game, the stakes feel high, and I love that. I love that this flows into the ink ribbons too, and only being able to save and wanting to be conservative about how you're saving your progress and stuff like that. I feel like the survival horror relationship in this game really goes hand in hand. And the horror is amplified because of how strapped for inventory space you are in items. Like, they really are working in tandem with one another. And when you see a zombie, it's less scary because, oh my gosh, it's a zombie. It's a horrifying monster. It's scary because I don't want that thing to kill me and then I lose my progress, or like, who knows when the last time you saved at a typewriter or something was. I think this is a perfect marriage of the two, and I don't know how many other games do it well to this effect.
It's a well-designed game inspired by limitation, because on the PlayStation 1, obviously there's a limitation of how many assets they could put on the screen, how many enemies they could have at once. That's why they have the preset camera angles and they use pre-rendered backgrounds to amplify the graphics, because it was all pre-rendered, and so there was more in the polygons and things like that. And so when you think about those restrictions of hardware design and like the time to actually make the game and release it within a budget and stuff, you realize that all these things fit together. We've got 6 item slots, or 8 if you're Jill or whatever. And zombies take like 6-8 bullets to kill, to quote unquote,
unless you
kill.
get lucky and you get a headshot and then you screech and rejoice.
So ammo goes from, I've got 15 bullets, to, oh, this is only enough to maybe kill 2. Maybe.
Yes.
And then the rarity of the shotgun ammo, at least up front. Later on in the game, it seems fairly generous in the remake and stuff. So you've got that. Well, how do we add tension to these encounters besides limiting ammo? There's no checkpoints. It's your last save, which could have been a limitation of the hardware as well at the time.
I mean, it very much was, because, I mean, at the time, save points were just a common thing in all games.
And memory cards.
Yeah.
So how do we add tension and survival and horror to it? Increments. There are limited saves in a run. On normal, it seemed fairly generous, at least in the remake. I never went below 3, and that could have been the conservatism on my part.
I think I played on normal as well. I think I ended with like 15 ink ribbons in my inventory.
Okay, you had more than me. I saved, I think, about 40 times. I was pretty liberal with it.
Maybe I just found more.
That's also possible. So, but that's a great and interesting mechanic, the limitation of saving. That's definitely not felt in later games. It's obviously a non-issue in later ones, which is a little sad. Now you can do that on higher difficulties.
I mean, 2 and 3, I think 2 I know for sure still had ink ribbons. I'm pretty sure original 3 did as well.
Maybe.
So yeah.
Perhaps. So, it's interesting how they use restriction and limitation to influence design and make a better game. That is a testament of design, I think, for sure. Because it's never, like, I was frustrated at times with the inventory system. I was like, I need both these keys, but I don't have room for them to also have these items. This is why I never had the lighter or the canteen. I was like, I can't afford to burn these corpses. I just can't.
That is one thing. Perhaps the most annoying thing is that the keys do take up slots. That is one thing that I wish could be changed, because I think you're already so limited on inventory space to make the keys that you need in order to progress also take, like, that just feels...
If I knew which key went to which door after I tried a door, I think that would have helped alleviate that.
Yeah.
Because I definitely would go... There were times where I had 3 keys in my inventory because I just didn't know what I needed where I was going, because I couldn't remember.
And you got to open them all. You got to open them all before the game prompts you to, like, hey, you can get rid of this now. You can discard
you have to. I still had the sword key by the end of the game because there was probably one sword door I missed. Not in my inventory. Eventually, I was like, all right, I clearly don't need this anymore to progress. I threw it
But it
away.
was just one area of the game that you didn't end up exploring. Yeah.
So I don't think the solution to that problem was more inventory space. I think because that robs it of the tension and survival aspect of it. And I struggle to think of how they could have improved. Maybe it is keys don't take up a space. Maybe it is you can change the one key item, the one item that never leaves your inventory. Maybe the rule there is it can't be a weapon. It's got to be a utility. I did appreciate that the stun batteries or the knives did not take up inventory space. Those were a special owned slot. I do appreciate that. Maybe ammo didn't need to take up I don't know. But there feels like there could have been just one tweak in the inventory system to alleviate the frustration but maintain the ingenuity of survival. So
I do feel like keys really, like making keys not take up a slot. Like that should just be like that's even a thing in other RPG, I think of role-playing games specifically where things are designated as key items. Like this is not something that is like Fallout's a good example. Or Elder Scrolls, where you will have certain things on your character that, like weapons and stuff like that are a certain weight, and your character can become over encumbered, and then you can't walk as much. But key items that you usually, things that in those games that you usually need, they put a weight designation of 0 on them because they know that you need them, so they're not going to make it take up. Yeah, they're not going to make it be added to your weight because they know that it's something you need to progress in the game. And I feel like the keys in particular, and any other, maybe not all the key items in the game, like I think of like the umbrella symbols that you need to get into the basement and things like that. Like those I think could have still taken up item slots or inventory slots. But the anything that you need in order to access doors, or advance or anything like that, I think would have been a lot better served if they did not take up inventory slots. But then I guess you're just carrying a bunch of guns on you, which is kind of against the point of the game that you're not supposed to be mowing things down. So it is a really difficult thing to balance and adjust. I think for the most part, the downside of the inventory system is that it just leads to a lot of backtracking. And again, as somebody who played through Chris's route, I probably felt this more than you did because I had 6 slots rather than 8. So I was taking a lot of trips to the item box. And that is, I mean, yeah, a lot of my time spent in this game. This game probably took me, I don't know, this run was probably 7 to 8, 9 hours, something in there, I believe.
Mine was 11 hours.
Okay. So yeah, mine was, I mean, I knew where I was going though. So it makes sense that, so it makes sense that mine was shorter, but even then of that time that I was spent playing, most of that, maybe not most of it, but quite a bit of those hours was spent like, oh, I just have to backtrack now and I have to go get this. And like, there are ideal paths in this game. Like there are Resident Evil 1 aficionados who know the ideal routes and the speedrun routes that you can take and the things that you need on your person at any given moment. I'm obviously not one of those people. I love this series, but I'm not one of those folks. But yeah, lots of backtracking if you're just playing this game pretty casually. So
that kind of reminds me of one of my big gripes with the world design of this.
Yeah, let's talk about the mansion. I wanted to talk about the mansion and the world design anyway, so yeah.
I was going to say, the mansion in particular, my biggest gripe with the mansion is that a lot, the areas, rooms, segments don't feel unique or separate from each other. And I really struggled to remember which room or which side of the house like this space was. Eventually I kind of got a groove because you keep, in my playthrough at least, I kept going kind of to the same quadrants. But it was sometimes like, is it in this door or is it this door? And it suffers. I kept thinking, you know, when you play Metroid, you remember the layout of the planet fairly well. It's like, this is Brinstar, this is Norfair, this is, you know, these are all these different places.
Yeah.
Lava, fire, whatever. And that's fairly obvious. Fire planet, so on and so forth. But this game also reminds me a ton of, which makes total sense now, Luigi's Mansion. Yeah. Nintendo clearly looked at Resident Evil when making Luigi's Mansion.
Yes.
Absolutely. As someone coming to this, you know, in reverse, I've played Luigi's Mansion plenty of times.
The door animations and everything.
Exactly. It's great. But Luigi's Mansion, the rooms, hallways, and connecting areas all were unique. Like the board game Clue. Each room stands on its own, and in Luigi's Mansion, each room stands on its own, and they're sectioned together. The first area in Luigi's Mansion is the father's study, their bedroom, and the baby nursery. So that's the family part of the house. And
Yeah.
it's just far more manageable in your brain to remember. In Resident Evil's mansion, in Spencer Mansion, it's like, the library's here, and this room has a bunch of knights. Like, but, oh, here's where the snake is, but there's a garden. It wasn't as memorable distinctly. And that led to a lot of frustration navigationally for me. Maybe if the map had room names, that would help. Official names.
I think so broadly, I agree with you. I think it's very hard to map out the Spencer Mansion in your head compared to many other sprawling video game locations that are kind of similar to how this area is laid out. I do think the reason why I struggle personally to map this out in my head, though, is because of the set camera locations. I think I can map things out better in my head when I am controlling the character in a 3D, like a typical third-person 3D space. I mean, similar to like how the Remade games are. Like you're actually controlling the character and you're moving about in a 3D environment and you're controlling where you can go in that world. You have control of the camera and what you're looking at a given moment. In this game, I think the set camera spots and the pre-rendered backgrounds and stuff like that you're moving through makes it a bit more jarring from moment to moment. And I can still, like, even thinking about it now, I still have a general layout of how the mansion is laid out in my head, but I don't know, like, I forget. I don't have it down to a T in the way that I do other video game locations, and I do think a lot of that is just because of the presentation and the camera work in the game personally. And I don't know if that tracks with you as well, potentially, or not.
Well, you have to imagine they're using a lot of the same textures, environments. Actually, one of the most unique things in the game are the doors. Almost every door is unique, which is great. Well, we should talk about the doors in a minute. But the camera angles, for the most part, do eventually mirror each other. It's, we're in this corner of the room. We're looking down on the hallway this way. There are some unique camera shots that are awesome. When the camera cuts to it, I'm like, holy smokes. Like, that's the power of having predetermined camera angles and hallways and lighting. Yeah. Like, they can make the perfect shot. I think a lot of like I don't know what you would call it, the crypt, I guess, in the back of the house.
I was going to say the same one. Running down the stairs to
it tilts.
Yes.
And the light, the fire, it's just like, this is horror at the right time too, because there's that coffin you've got to get to descend with the masks and stuff. So yeah, it can be a really powerful visual technique and iconic moments, like you and I both remembering that particular staircase. But then there's other times where it's like, well, this hallway goes this way or that way, like it connects to this door. Which room does this lead to, or which door does that? I found myself pausing a lot to look at the map and go, am I at the right door to where I want to go? And I think it's also hard. The other thing I think of, it's hard to get a full layout for the mansion when you are running into roadblocks so often, because a lot of these areas you're only coming back to, once you have the right key or the right item that will allow you to access these areas. So like you're making your initial run through of the mansion, you're trying to get a general layout of how this building is set up and what all these different places are, but you're blocked off in this area and you can't access that until maybe a couple hours later, and you can't go here until you have this certain item, and I found this weird like stone crest door that I can't walk into yet, and that ends up becoming like the outside or the garden area or whatever. Like you can't access these certain parts of the game until later on, and so it does lead to it feeling more disjointed because of that, I believe. I beyond the mansion's design, I guess, what did you just think about it on the whole as like this? I mean, it is a single location you are spending time in within this game, and it's got a lot of different aspects to it. Like, I think about, again, with Resident Evil 2, I'm going to use this as a touchstone since you've played that one before, but it starts in the police station and that's where a lot of it is, but then it goes to the sewers and then there's some tunnels and stuff like that later, and then eventually you end up in like a train depot situation type thing. Like, there are different aspects like that, and they all kind of stand out from one another. And there are distinct areas of this game as well, like I mentioned, the outside garden area, and you get down to the basement, but it does feel like it's all part of the same compound, if that makes any sense. Like, it does feel like a singular
congruent location, which I think is one of the game's strongest points, especially compared to later installments where they do start globetrotting a bit more and going to a variety of different locations.
I love the atmosphere and thematic design of this place, especially the notes and collectibles.
Yes.
Tying in like the design of the mansion and how it is they've trapped the designer and creator. It reminds me a lot of Icarus. Is it Daedalus is his father?
I believe no, it's Icarus.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Or in God of War 3, the guy who designs the cube. I think it is Daedalus. So
Daedalus is the big guy.
Well, you'll find it for me, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like the gods have cursed him to design this puzzle and labyrinth and all that stuff. Same thematic concept, which is great. It gives texture and a creepy lore to this place. And from my understanding, also I think Lisa is only a part of the remake. She's not in the original version
Trevor,
of the game at all. So that adds kind of just the cruelty of Umbrella, really paints it while adding this super creepy character who fleshes out the garden shack area and the tunnels that you eventually connect to and shows you how all of these areas are connected and the experimentation going on. So I like the way that the layers are peeled back on this evil corporation in this spooky mansion where they do experiments. That is truly some wonderful and fun world building and design.
Especially as you start to learn later on in the game, like some of the journal entries I really like, okay, if we're going to enact this plan, who's going to stop us? The stars are going to stop us. Okay, how do we lure the stars to here and take them out of the picture? Like you start to get those kind of things and you're like, then your brain really starts working like, okay, what is going on here? Like, how are we lured to this location?
And you're thinking, oh crap, I'm lured to this location. Like, oh, their plan is working.
Yes, you start to realize that you're not there by an accident like you thought you were initially, which is a great little twist later on. And some of the twists, we'll talk about the characters and actually, let's just do that now. The story of this game, I mean, I think it's very simple. You get called to the mansion, this S.T.A.R.S, this elite group of cops, essentially, that police around Raccoon City. They get called to the mansion, and then, things happen from there, zombies. And I guess, what did you think? There's not a lot to say about the story. This story very much is evil corporation creates a virus and tries to get away with it. And then I guess the big reveal is just that Wesker's a bad boy, and they got a big super weapon hiding under the mansion with Tyrant, and then the mansion blows up.
So kind of like in Fast and Furious, where you knew going in that Letty is not actually dead. I've come into knowing Wesker is a bad guy, so
yeah,
that not a surprise. Not that the game really hides it all too terribly well, especially the fact that Wesker he's not in the game until
the dude with slicked back hair and sunglasses is actually evil. Wow, what? Never would have saw it coming.
Yeah, so it's fun. That feels like the B element of the horror, which is essential to horror. It's great. That is a part of that genre, and I think it works really well here. There's some hilarious lines and dialogue and just some campiness that comes out of it that works, even what they've changed in the remake, and I can only imagine what it's like in the original. So it's good. I'm excited to see how more of this is fleshed out and connected later. Like, I know Chris plays such a prominent role going on. I know Jill from 3. I don't think Jill really plays that big of a role in later mainline games. I think she's the star of Revelations, correct?
Yeah, she gets put in Revelations, I believe. Yeah.
Which is a shame. Like, she should be the star of all the games. But anyway, that's my 2 cents because Resident Evil 3 is so good.
You mentioned the one thing that I want to, and this is what I've stressed for the longest time up front, is as we move forward and we talk about the stories throughout the rest of this season, none of the stories in any of the Resident Evil games, like even the best ones in the series, 4, I don't know, I like 7
The president's daughter has been kidnapped by a cult.
None of the stories in these games are landmark by any means, but they're also not it's also not a drawback of the games either. What it is it's a tool for campiness to creep in for the most part. And that's what I love, is that Capcom, I think with this first game in the series, the reason why stuff like Jill Sandwich and, you're the master of unlocking, like a lot of these...
part of that is translation differences, Japan and
part
English.
of it's translation, and part of it I think is just poor writing in a general sense.
Yes.
However, I think as the years went on, Capcom became self-aware to the point that, and I think maybe they always were to some degree, realizing that these games weren't meant to be taken super seriously, and they just kind of leaned into it more as time went on, and I think that became to the series' benefit as we move forward. Because again, these games are not ones that we will talk about the story with. Like I think we've spent a lot of time talking about story elements and character elements, and we'll probably talk about characters more than anything in this season. But I think we've spent a lot of time, when we played through all the God of War games, we talked about the stories quite a bit in each of those, and obviously Fast and Furious, those are totally story driven because they're films, stuff like that. Stories are never going to be the forefront of these Resident Evil games, but it is a way for the campiness to creep in, and that is such a core element of what Resident Evil is, and that's why I love it, is because it is unabashedly just goofy, and it is simultaneously a horror franchise and probably one of the most ridiculously silly things I've ever seen in my entire life. Similar to how I would compare it to like Metal Gear Solid in a lot of ways.
That's just where I was going. You've compared it in the past to to Metal Gear Solid, and just the over the top silliness. And Metal Gear
Solid has actual like good story, I would say.
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
It's a greatly engaging story in Metal Gear Solid for sure, and it's much more at the forefront. But it also does not take itself seriously. I mean, one of the main core plot elements of Metal Gear Solid is that a man replaces his arm with another man's arm, and then that man's ghost takes him over. It's not taking itself seriously at all, and that's how Resident Evil 4 is. Not 4. Resident Evil in general is. I said 4 because I was thinking of the plot pitch with that. Oh, my daughter was kidnapped by random villagers in the middle of Europe. Yeah. So
its charm, and it adds to I think the richness and legacy of the whole series on the whole. It's and that also, to my understanding, lends itself into other media that Resident Evil has tapped into, like the films. You may have seen other Resident Evil movies, but last year when we all got together for the Game Awards, we went and saw that Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City movie.
Welcome to Raccoon City. Yeah, it sucked.
It was awful, totally awful. But we still had a really fun time as an experience and making fun of it.
Because we knew what we were signing up for. At least I did.
I had no idea. I didn't realize it was Resident Evil 2 was essentially what that game was, with a splash of Resident Evil 1 now coming back playing this game. So. But it's a part of the franchise as a whole, outside of just the games, and it's part of that DNA that started here.
Yes. Let's talk about the characters while we are talking about some more story-ish elements of Resident Evil. You played Jill's run. Obviously, I played Chris's run. Jill's run is, this is strange to say. I know a lot about Jill's run, but I've never played it through to completion. I've only ever dabbled with her run. Anytime I've played this game, I've played Chris's run in both of my instances, which is odd. But anyway, I think Jill's run is definitely the definitive run in this game when it comes to story, like good moments to have. Chris doesn't get a lot to do in this game, honestly. He's very much more... He's more isolated than Jill is, I would say. He bounces off of Rebecca in the way that Jill bounces off of Barry, but Jill's dynamic with Barry is there's a lot more there, and there's a lot more of a relationship. Rebecca just kind of seems like somebody that Chris stumbles across and then happens to be like, oh, I guess we should, work together and we should try to help each other out. And they have a couple moments throughout the game together. Jill and Barry are very much like tied at the hip in many instances across this game, if I am not wrong.
Tied at the hip is in they bump into each other quite a bit, but then Barry makes
Yeah.
up an excuse for them to separate again, which is always very poor. And narratively later is because he's double crossing you this whole time until you find out that he's actually being black, or his family's being held hostage, allegedly. So it's
By cartoonishly evil Wesker.
Yes. So, Barry's always like, I'll investigate. Why don't you go back out there to face who knows what? So Barry is awkward, very awkward. His lines, his structure, he's probably one of the more campy kind of characters just in the horror theme of it. It's funny. And Jill kind of just goes, okay. Obviously, that is corrected later on where she, later games with her in it, she's actually more of a character than just an agent for the player.
Yeah, I would say they very much feel like blank slates in this game. Like Chris is a far cry from what he develops into as well.
That was the philosophy of the time. And, maybe not forward thinking, but kind of cool that a male character and a female character were options to play and had some different experiences and abilities. It wasn't just a skin swap.
That very much feels far ahead of its time in a lot of ways. I didn't know this was a dual campaign game before we started really planning for the season. I kind of thought that was only in Resident Evil 2. I thought that was a big thing for Resident Evil 2. No, it's actually par for the course. And so I like that element to it, but I also like that they don't deviate so much where it's like, you really got to play both to get you do have to play both to get the full story, but it's not so much in the way. The full story doesn't even make sense because, if you're playing Chris's run, then Jill's going to be the one that gets locked away in the jail cell at the end. You got to save her, same vice versa. So they don't link up in the same way that the story does in Resident Evil 2, where like Claire and Leon get together by the end of it, and then there's like a greater resolution at the end of the two campaigns. Yeah, they feel like blank slates for what's to come. Like I said, Wesker feels like the only character who is very similar to how he is in later games, which I love. And Wesker is just here's the thing I will say as far as characters go in this game. I think the best character of the game is just Umbrella, which is a weird thing to say because it's an entity, but throughout the entire series, in a lot of ways, and some of this gets peeled back later and you start to learn who's more at the head of Umbrella. And a lot of this kind of gets revealed in Code Veronica. But for the most part, Umbrella is just sort of this faceless evil entity that is then represented to you visually as the player or whatever characters you're playing as various baddies that you run across. In a lot of instances, it's Wesker, and it's Wesker in this game. He just happens to be the evil, Umbrella representative to go along with all the zombies and stuff like that. And they really keep that going throughout the majority of the series. You never really... There are key players that you read about that were integral to Umbrella's rise and doing all of this. But even then, they keep, looking further down the road, like, I'll say this because I know you've already played the game, but even like with Resident Evil Village, you find out Mother Miranda in that game has ties that they've introduced going back to Resident Evil 1, and it turns out she's one of the chief bad guys. Like, there's really no... In a lot of ways, Umbrella is just this kind of faceless entity that is presented... Yeah, kind of. Like there is no singular person that you can grasp onto and be like, they're at the core of all of this. Again, comparing to Metal Gear. Like with Metal Gear, the main evil villain, I guess, would be like Liquid. And yes, and he's the guy at the center of it. And while there are central antagonists and villains throughout all of the Resident Evil games, Umbrella remains this like obscure entity, this harbinger of evil throughout all the games, even when they kind of dissolve and things later on change in some of the later games. They are still this kind of nebulous force out in the ether that you don't really know what's going on with. You don't know if they're ever really gone for good or anything like that. And they lay those seeds. I guess what I'm saying is, even outside of the context of the larger series, they lay those seeds quite well in this game. You talked about how like the designer of the Spencer Mansion talks about getting trapped in his own place that he designed and stuff like that. And you think like, well, who would have done this to him? Or who is the person that hired Wesker to flip on the stars and stuff like that? And you're never told those things. It's just kind of Umbrella did it. And you don't really get further knowledge outside of that. And I think that's that doesn't only go into the campiness of the game that we already talked about, but it keeps it devoid of getting. I just like that there's no central thing that you can cling on to, or no central person at the center of this that you can cling on to. By keeping it so broad, it keeps the story, it keeps it more focused on the zombies as well. I feel like that those are the main villains, is the monsters that this company has created, and that's what you need to be concerned about more about. Who did this and who lies at the center of this whole ordeal.
I think a faceless corporation can be scarier than an individual to begin with.
Yeah.
And that amplifies the horror. And, you know, what I do know about the games I've played in the future and stuff, just knowing Umbrella is involved, even in things like Village or 7, especially with those games being kind of segmented, they were pitched initially as segments off of the mainline series, you know, a reinvention of the series with first person and the whole deal. But it's like, nah, Umbrella is still here and a part of this.
Well, it's in different ways.
Yes.
Yeah. They just keep folding it back. Like, no matter, even when you think Umbrella's gone, it gets folded back in ways that you're like, oh, what?
Which makes it feel omnipresent and always pulling the strings, and you can never. Even if you nuke a whole city, you can't get rid of them. And that adds to the even before playing any Resident Evil games, I knew what Umbrella represented. I knew the logo of this fake company.
Yes.
So it speaks to the proportion of just the mythos surrounding it.
Yes.
And it all starts here.
The villain, it's just a much different villain to feature in a video game. It's not a Bowser, it's not a Ganondorf, and again, Wesker is like the villain of Resident Evil in a lot of ways, but he's not the villain at the same time. Like, he's not the person pulling all the strings. He's just a lackey for other people in some ways, although it does become a personal thing. We'll get into that later, further down the line. One thing I do want to talk about, there are a couple other things I want to talk about, but we'll run through them here quickly. Question for you. What did you think about just the monsters in general in this game? We've kind of touched on a lot of them naturally over the course of the game, but, you know, we've got your basic zombies, we've got your Cerberus, which is the dogs, the Crimson Heads, but then we've got other weird stuff like Yawn the Snake, and Neptune the Shark, and Black Tiger, the large giant spider. There are some weird, the giant plant 42, the giant plant in the back garden shed area. I don't know. What did you think about some of the monster designs in this game and what they do with them?
I like the animals, but they make no sense.
Yes. Here's a giant spider in the tunnels, in the mines that you find.
The spider felt forced.
Yes.
Mostly because the spider is super easy.
Well, because they give you a flamethrower to take him down right beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they did for me.
No,
sorry.
No flamethrower for me. I had a broken
difference between
flamethrower
runs.
I had to use to hold a door open. I did not find
that's another thing that happens in the Chris run. Yeah, I had to do that part, but I got a real flamethrower. Jill gets a grenade launcher though instead, correct? You can get one.
Oh yeah, with acid rounds and stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's earlier. So yeah, the spider felt forced. It's like, oh, it's a scary game. We should have a spider. The snake feels weird because it's so ginormous.
Yeah, it feels like you end up in the Chamber of Secrets out of
a little
nowhere.
bit. The shark kind of makes sense simply because it's in this water area. It's like, okay, I guess, but also,
but even the water area is kind of bizarre because like you can drain the water, and it's like, well, why are we flooding?
But also,
this spot
one way I died was I didn't. The game, there was no prompt or camera angle switch for the computer. So the water just like filled up. And I was like, okay, I'll just climb the ladder. And like the water stopped filling up at the base, like where you're standing. It never goes up past where you would actually drown. But the game just went, game over. It was like, how did I die?
During the sequence where you have to close the shutters.
Stuff.
Yeah.
So that was a bit odd. Yeah, the animals don't make sense, but I like them there nonetheless.
Yeah.
The monsters.
The hunters are great. I like the hunters quite a bit. The large reptile-looking things.
They reveal those all in a sensible order.
I like the hunter's intro cutscene too, where it sleuths through the entire environment that you just came from and busts into that room that you know you're in. That's a really eerie sequence because you've just come all that way to get back into the mansion, and then it cuts to that and it retraces all your steps and jumps into that same room you're in. That's a good moment. I like that moment.
The enemy I hated the most were the crows. Mostly because if you get locked in a animation with them, where one crow comes and attacks you, and then one comes as the other one is, you can't break out of it, and it's like 3 crow hits and you're dead.
Death by 1,000 crow cuts, yeah.
And that happened to me at least twice. So I'm not a fan of the crows at all. Crows can go away.
Any feelings on Tyrant in particular, the main final big baddie there at the end? What'd you think about him?
Super easy. I will say this, Barry died at the very end. That's because Tyrant decided to grab him in a chokehold while waiting for the helicopter at just the perfect part where, I don't know, 3 camera angles intersected and I couldn't like get to an angle where I felt comfortable enough aiming. And honestly, Barry died off screen. I didn't even know he was dead. So I was super bummed about
Poor
that.
Barry.
I obviously could just reload my save and with Barry, but I was done at that point. So I was pretty mad that happened because of camera wonkiness.
Yeah.
But Tyrant, he's way scarier in later games.
Iconic is like one of the first.
He feels more iconic later on.
He feels he's iconic within the larger scope of the series, I guess.
Yes,
is what I'm saying.
I didn't feel very impressed this go
because he's the first big baddie zombie that you're introduced to. Because this is before we ever get to, Nemesis and any of this
Mr.
other
X.
crazy stuff that happens. Yeah, Mr. X. I have a couple other. I think we've touched on a lot of things. One other aspect that I did want to touch on was the music. I think this game has quite a good score, and I did want to ask you in particular about the soundtrack. How did you feel whenever you entered a save room? Did the music really put you at ease? Because it absolutely does for me.
From my notes. Quote, the theme of a save room offers relief. Fear is alleviated, but tension lingers with the knowledge of limited saves and the indisputable fact that you will have to go back outside and face the danger. But save rooms are tranquil and offer reprieve. So yes.
But the music is equal parts. It is tranquil and it does make you feel at ease for just a moment. But the composition behind that song is so good because there is like an undercurrent of uneasiness and like tension within the song itself. The song sounds equal parts like soothing and also just nerve-wracking. Like it's a really, really exceptional piece of music. I really think the save room song in this game, and there's different save room themes in all of the different games, but I really do think that this one in the original Resident Evil is one of the best. Speaking more to the larger soundtrack as a whole, I do like that this game uses music sparingly. It allows the sound effects of the mansion to serve as the backdrop for the soundscape that you are hearing. Because a lot of games will pump in music, maybe not constantly, but quite a bit. And this game really allows for silence at times. And it allows every creak and every little thing that you're hearing off in the distance to unnerve you. Or maybe it's the birds outside or the whooshing against the sides of the mansion house. Like this game's sound design is impeccable, and I think that's reflected in a lot of the future games as well. And in the moments where music does enter the equation, I think it amplifies the tension that much more, because it is it's not used constantly.
I fully agree. It is good sound design is essential to horror. You have to let the sounds of the environment creep into your skin. You can't constantly have the theme of whatever theme it is playing in the background. But when the music does come in, it amplifies the experience. Ironically, I was listening to a podcast today on sound design. They were talking about a TV show, Ted Lasso. It was 20,000 Hertz for those that are interested or curious. But one of the things that the sound designers in that interview were talking about was, you can't have silence without loud moments, and you can't have loud moments without silence. The two go together, and Resident Evil balances them well. When it is loud and bombastic or, tense and high, it's deserved and it matches the moment. But when it's quiet, tension still runs. So it's a well-designed game from a sound perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think those are all the major things I wanted to touch on. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up before we start to kind of wrap up here? Anything from your notes that may have stood out in your first run through? There's still a lot we could talk about.
I think the tunnels area feels unnecessary. Felt a little crammed there at the end. I was ready to go to the basement, so I didn't care for the tunnels. But beyond that,
the tunnels, I agree, are not great. It very much feels like, just kind of tacked on, artificially lengthening the game just a bit more. I do know two other things that I wanted to bring up. I'm glad we did this. Did you care for Lisa Trevor's story at all here in the remake? Because it is told somewhat subtly, but it is...
Oh, yeah.
It adds a bit of like heartbreak to the game, and adds some emotional depth to it.
Yeah, like it jacks up Umbrella even more. I loved it. I think it's a great added element to the remake. Yeah. It adds way more texture to it and nuance, but also isn't so ham-fisted where it's like, see how bad Umbrella is? They tortured this little girl. No, it jacks up the evil for sure.
And her whole family's involved with it too.
Her dad's the one that designed the mansion, and her mother had the wrong serum and died. So yeah, totally messed up. I enjoyed that plot and how it was told.
And it recontextualizes your encounters with her too, because when you first run into her, you just think, oh crap, another zombie. And then as you start to uncover what has actually happened to her, and you feel terrible about it. When I played it this time through, I tried to see if I could not fight her in certain instances, and unfortunately you are forced to eventually.
You don't have to fight her.
And the section where you gotta push her off, don't you have to? Or does she just run away?
You can just push the rocks off and open up her mother's grave.
Oh yeah, that's true. And then she
grabs the skull and jumps down.
That's what I did. But I guess the trophy still says get rid of Lisa Trevor or whatever. So I guess I just thought of it as killing her. The one other thing that we have to bring up, and that I did not bring up, and that I specifically said we would have to talk about, is the FMV opening of the original game. Yes, we played the remake, but Max, the opening cutscene of the original game is probably one of the most incredible landmark video game moments ever. It's so funny in retrospect. And what makes it funnier is that we talked about how we felt like these characters were largely blank slates. And I think they are in many ways with the game's writing this early on, and they become, there's greater depth to them added later on. But the FMV opening for the game in the original 1996 release really tried to make this seem... I don't know. It reminds me of this era where there was such a disparity between what you would see in cutscenes and videos of games, between the actual gameplay, or even with box art and stuff like that. Like you would check out a game at the store and the box art would show you one thing, and then you get home and play it and it's something completely else. That's the feelings I get from watching this. Like, it makes it feel like you're about to play a bro shooter. and then it turns into this weird
Scary
explore the
game.
mansion zombie survival inventory management game. It's just so funny to watch in retrospect, and it is so... This game came out in 1996. This video feels like it came from 1985 instead, which is also what I love about it.
It's really great. It's a hoot. I read a book called Resident Evil by Philip J. Reed. It's a boss fight books, one of their anthology books. Actually, around the time of our recording, sadly, Philip passed away. But one of the things that Philip did in this book that I loved was he tracked down the original actors and talked to them. And there's some really awesome insight. So I highly recommend picking up that book. There'll be a link in the show notes because it's super insightful just to learn what shooting and filming that was like, or recording those lines, the opening cutscenes and the final cutscenes, and what these actors thought working in Japan as native English speakers, which was a big reason why they were hired.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating stuff. I highly recommend that as some supplemental material. But these remind me a lot of those, other FMV kind of games like Night Trap, which you and I have played together. And
Yes.
It's just fun now to watch in 2022. And I'm probably in 96. It was, probably fun as well.
It was cool. I'm sure if you were a kid and you had this game for some reason you're booting up, it was an awesome opening, and then it becomes what it becomes. I think the funniest thing to me that I have to mention is that the actor that plays Barry in the video has a completely different accent from the version of the character in the game. Like the disparity, but like they did not use the same voice actor. I mean, to my knowledge, they did not use the same actors from that video in the game. Completely different voices for them, which just makes it that much sillier. Again, campiness at the core of Resident Evil, and this is why, if you don't think Resident Evil is campy, please go watch what everybody would have been introduced to, the very first thing anybody would have seen of this series back in 1996, and tell me what you think of it. Because hey, I don't know what people back then would have thought. If I was like 20, 25 in 1996, I would have played that. I don't know what I would have thought, but I feel like there's no way I wouldn't have thought that it was kind of hokey at the time. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. And technology has ruined how we look back at things. Legacy. What's this game's legacy, Max?
I feel like it's the same default answer as most games that spawn multi-million-dollar franchises. Yeah. It's the one that started it all.
Yeah, the first entries, the first episodes of these shows usually end up being somewhat similar. Like, oh, this game's legacy is that it launched the Resident Evil franchise, which is very much that. I'll take it a step. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think another element of its legacy is the GameCube remake, which has become a theme for Resident Evil. As we get ready for Resident Evil 4 remake getting ready to come out, these games have been remade, pretty fairly consistently. Yeah. And that's just the thing Capcom's done, and keeps these games accessible. As of this recording in the year 2022, every mainline Resident Evil game is on modern hardware, PS4 and Xbox One and Series consoles.
I think they're all on Switch too.
Yeah, on Switch as well. Capcom has done an excellent job of milking their really good franchise, but also keeping these games playable on modern hardware, not just being lost to time. A great comparison would be Silent Hill, which is largely unplayable and entirely too expensive these days. So, I think that's part of its legacy, and it all started with this GameCube one, which is when, like I mentioned earlier, Resident Evil went kind of GameCube exclusive for a hot minute.
Well, even going back to then, like we're talking about accessibility, like when I decided as a kid I wanted to play all the Resident Evil games, they were just all on GameCube for me to play. Like they've been porting these to current gen platforms for
and remaking them
a very long time, and remaking them.
2 and 3 were remakes on GameCube as well.
They weren't full-blown remakes in the same way. They were similar to their original counterparts. The graphics were touched up a bit, but they were their original versions. So this was the only
Interesting.
one
I
that was
didn't know
fully
that.
remake. Yeah, this was the only one that was a full remake, which is why when they started doing the remakes again, they jumped to 2. That was the one they started with.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense.
So, yeah. I think this game, the thing that I will say about Legacy at this point, outside of what we said about, spawning a franchise and all that, I think this game's big legacy nowadays is that it is really the only remaining game in the franchise. That's not true. It's not the only one. But it is one of the core games within the larger Resident Evil series that is still in this pure form of what this game's structure is, if that makes any sense. Like, if you want to think about what Resident Evil is and how it became the way it became, this game is still the touchstone for many of the ideas that the series still pulls from. Which I think there's something to say about that. Like, again, looking at other franchises we've played in the past, like God of War. Like God of War, the original God of War is still like the most recent God of War is still an action game, but it is greatly different from what the original release on PS2 was. I think Village and even Resident Evil 7, when Resident Evil 7 came out, what did it look to do? It looked to mimic in a lot of ways what the original game in the series did. And I think that that really speaks to what this game did, not only at the time when it first came out back in 1996, but I think that also speaks to the quality of this game's structure and what it is, what its goals are, and what it is trying to get you to do as the player with exploring this single sprawling location and the inventory management and all those things we've touched on already. I do really think that this game's legacy is its design and its structure, not only for Resident Evil as a whole, but the larger survival horror genre. I think this game's influence is really, really massive on what games have become over the past 20 years or so.
I think that does it for Resident Evil. Thank you so much for listening to this first episode of Season 5 of Chapter Select. If you'd like to follow the show on Twitter, you can at Chapter Select, or learn more at chapterselect.com. See all our previous seasons and whatnot. If you'd like to follow Logan on Twitter, he's at Moreman12, and you can find his writing over at comicbook.com. You can follow me on Twitter at MaxRoberts143 and my writing over at MaxFrequency.net. Thank you so much for listening. Join us next time as we dive into Resident Evil 7. And until then, adios. Chapter Select is a Max Frequency production. This episode was researched, produced, and edited by me, Max Roberts. Season 5 is hosted by Logan Moore and myself. Season 5 is all about Resident Evil. For more on this season, go to chapterselect.com/season 5. Follow the show at Chapter Select and check out previous seasons at chapterselect.com.